I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. The Australian Psychological Society, Headspace and other experts say many Australians will need more than 10 mental health consultations to cope with the flow and effects of COVID-19. To the government's credit, it adopted Labor's suggestion to increase the cap on Medicare mental health services in response to this summer's bushfires. Will it do the same in relation to COVID-19?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And one of the things we have done is invest very strongly in mental health. There have actually been a range of inputs, and I thank the opposition for their input, and I thank all of those who have contributed. In relation to mental health and the coronavirus epidemic in Australia, in particular, we've invested $669 million in telehealth, of which I'm advised 47.7% of all consultations in the previous week with regards to standard mental health items were conducted over the phone. In addition to that, what we've also seen is that general telehealth items have very significantly been for mental health. So it doesn't have to be confined to the particular mechanism which the member outlines. What we have opened up with telehealth is a much broader ability to access services. In conjunction with the services provided through telehealth, we have also made sure that there were specific psychological and psychiatric items that were also made available. On top of that, there was a $74 million investment focusing on support services for people, mostly over the online or through telehealth, through organisations such as the Black Dog Institute for Healthcare Workers, Origin for Young People, Lifeline, Kidsline, so many other different support groups, and in particular, Beyond Blue has led the coronavirus activity. And so where there are proposals, the government will always consider them. But what we have done already is, on the advice of the mental health officers, the Chief Medical Officer in particular, the Chair or CEO of the National Mental Health Commission and the Prime Minister's Suicide Prevention Advisor, Christine Morgan, establish the arrangements which are in place. And these have been critical to help save lives and protect lives during what is a difficult period. Where there are proposals, we'll always review them. But what we have done so far has been, I would say, potentially world-leading, and in particular, the National Cabinet will be considering the National Mental Health Pandemic Plan this week, and we are making very good progress with the states. And I want to thank the Prime Minister for his support and his leadership in drawing that into the National Cabinet.
The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. We've all seen that Australians are stepping up to meet the health and economic challenges of the coronavirus pandemic. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's plan to fight the virus and its economic effects is backing Australians in?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Curtin for her question. And can I commend her on this past year that she's been elected to this place almost now for the great work that she's done, and the many other members that have joined us since that last election. Mr Speaker, despite the tremendous challenges that our country faces, I and my government are very optimistic about Australia's future. We're very positive about this future. Some weeks ago, in fact some months ago, I said that Australians were strong, but that strength would be put to the test in the weeks, months that followed. Australians are passing that test of strength each and every day as we work through the many challenges that they have faced individually, personally, in their own lives, amongst their own families, in their own communities, in their own businesses, workplaces, wherever they may be. They are confronting and dealing with the challenges in a very uniquely Australian way, proving to the world, as we said when we gathered here soon after the outbreak of the COVID crisis, that we are demonstrating as a nation how effective a nation such as ours, a liberal democratic nation, can be in responding to the coronavirus, and showing the way around the world with the success that Australians have been able to achieve. They have a confidence because we have a plan, and that plan is working, but the job is not done. Fighting the virus, flattening the curve, as the Minister for Health set out earlier today in his ministerial statement. Extending the economic lifeline, connecting to Australians to help them get through on that bridge to the other side, as the Treasurer set out yesterday in his ministerial statement. Buying us much-needed time, so now we are able to reopen the economy and the society based on the important protections that we have put in place, the building up of our health system, the scaling up of our ICU capacity, the expansion of our testing regime, the COVID Safe App, which we continue to encourage Australians to download each and every day so we can reopen. Building confidence and momentum then follows from that, as does resetting for growth in a post-COVID world. And Australians are more confident. Today's Westpac index of consumer confidence demonstrating this, a 16.4% jump, the highest in 50 years, rebounding back from the terrible blow to confidence that was inflicted as a result of the COVID crisis. The ANZ confidence index rebounding some 70% from the big falls that we saw several weeks ago, as Australians are feeling more confident because they have confidence in the plan and the way forward. But ultimately, they have confidence in themselves, their communities, their strength, and that, Mr Speaker, is the key to Australia's success in combating this crisis, and it will continue to be. We are in this together, and Australians are succeeding together.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister stand by his claim businesses, the economy and his budget will snap back?
Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
I have every confidence in Australian businesses, Mr Speaker, and it's more than confidence in Australian businesses to rebuild on the other side of this crisis. I have confidence of businesses being at the centre of our economy and the regrowth that we will see in our economy that will support the incomes and livelihoods of Australians, not just now but in the decades into the future. Because as Liberal and Nationals, we have never believed that government should be at the centre of the economy, that Australians should see a future for themselves only being dependent on the support of other taxpayers, but seeing their own livelihoods being supported by businesses investing and creating jobs, Mr Speaker. Some 1.5 million jobs created over these last 6.5 years, and those jobs have been decimated, Mr Speaker, by Mr Speaker, this terrible COVID crisis that has hit the world. But in the same way, when we came to government and we rebuilt the nation's finances and we rebuilt the strength of the economy, Mr Speaker, and Mr Speaker, that led to 1.5 million Australians getting into jobs. Australians can have confidence that on the other side of this crisis, the government, Mr Speaker, can apply the same discipline, the same faith and the same confidence in Australians and the businesses and the enterprising spirit and the innovative nature that we've seen as businesses have adapted in this crisis. Now, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, may want to engage in the semantics of this, but I can tell you what I'm engaged in, Mr Speaker, and that is, Mr Speaker, the fortitude and the strength of the Australian people and the strength of the Australian economy, which even still, in the midst of this crisis, even still, with the delivery of the single largest income support this country has ever seen, ratings agencies around the world know that we've got this covered. And it's true that as we've sought to raise the finances necessary to pay for that economic lifeline to Australians, then the subscription of our bonds, Mr Speaker, who have sought that finance around the world, has been subscribed over and over and over again. And the reason for that, Mr Speaker, is because people have confidence in this country. I have confidence in this country, and I believe this country will bounce back and bounce strongly under the leadership of this government.
And I call the member for Mallee.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is supporting communities and industries during the coronavirus pandemic through the COVID-19 Relief and Recovery Fund?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the hard-working member for Mallee for her question, Mr Speaker. She and her Victorian electorate, Mr Speaker, they are resilient people, and regional Australians people are always resilient. They have an air of optimism and positivity and hope about them, and they have to, Mr Speaker, because whenever we have a crisis befall our nation, whether it's drought, and of course we endured that in some areas. I know the Minister for Agriculture, his electorate, Maranoa, has endured it for 7 years. Whether it's bushfires and our summer from hell, Mr Speaker, affected so many electorates, so many parts of regional Australia. Whether it's floods, which followed the bushfires in some parts, and now, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Regional Australians, through all of that, come out the other side because of their resilience, because of their fighting spirit. They are, of course, responsible, these regional Australians, for the food, the fibre, export revenue that our nation nobly holds so dearly. Mr Speaker, as the member for Mallee well knows, when our regions are strong, so too is our nation, and this has never been more apparent than right now. And as part of the COVID-19 Relief and Recovery Fund, a $1 billion fund set aside to ensure that industries get through the other side, we've seen the uptake of assistance available, and it's going to help regional Australians so much. Justin Peretina, who is the president of the Geraldton Professional Fishermen's Association and Geraldton Lobster Fishermen, he said in support of this initiative, "It's a step in the right direction. It started things moving, has got boats back on the water and people back in jobs. We hope that every week we can start fitting a little bit more in as trade ramps back up." And I know this is just as important in Western Australia as it is in the Victorian electorate that the member for Mallee represents so proudly. It's a perfect example of real benefits from a genuine fund flowing to industry to help them preserve and protect livelihoods, jobs and workers' ability to go to work, because we know that so many businesses have had to, unfortunately, shut their doors. Mark Ryan, the Chief Executive Officer of Tassal, Tasmanian-based salmon farming company, they employ 1,000 people. 1,000 people. He said this means Australian farmers, he's talking about this initiative, and fishers can continue supporting their workforces, confidently operate their essential services during these uncertain times, and also show leadership in Australia's recovery ahead. This government is also showing leadership, and I know the Parliament, Mr Speaker, moreover, is showing leadership to get through COVID-19. And I know that $1 billion fund is helping so many regional Australians get through this. They've been hard hit. They've been hard hit by so much in recent times, but they will get by because of their positivity, because of their optimism and because of their renowned resilience.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What is the government doing to assist barley red meat growers and producers affected by recent trade restrictions announced by China, and to protect the thousands of jobs currently at risk, including abattoir workers in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Like all members of this chamber, we hold concerns for the way this issue is being progressed at this point in time. This is a matter that the government has been raising now for a considerable period of time, and in fact I've done so on several occasions in my direct meetings with the Premier Li Keqiang, most recently late last year. So this is an issue, as the member would be aware, has been running for some time in relation to anti-dumping. Now, of course, we reject any suggestion of those matters being relevant to Australia's exports, particularly of barley. I mean, Australian agriculture is not one that is supported by subsidy. It is one supported by the ingenuity and good management of the Australian agricultural sector. And so any suggestion that Australia's agricultural exports are the subject of some sort of government subsidisation is completely and utterly rejected. And these are the very points that we make directly as part of the comprehensive strategic partnership that was able to be concluded by this government many years ago. And we are continuing to use the channels of that relationship and that partnership to be able to progress these matters, as well as directly with the relevant authorities in China regarding their anti-dumping review in relation to barley. Now, similarly, the matters in relation to abattoirs are also being progressed. Those matters relate to what are claimed to be paperwork administration issues in relation to Australia's meat exports, and we will continue to advocate and set out Australia's case very, very clearly. But let me be very clear about one thing. Australia stands very firmly behind our agricultural producers, and we also stand firmly about where we see the role of the Australian economy in the broader world. We have great confidence in our outward look as a trading nation, and we engage with all partners in good faith with the purpose of ensuring the increase in global trade. That is the basis for our relationship with the Chinese government when it comes to our comprehensive strategic partnership. It works across many different areas. It has been a highly successful agreement, but from time to time there will be differences of views about those issues, and we'll seek to progress them in a very constructive way, in the national interest, always in the national interest.
And I call the member for Kennedy.
Treasurer, cannot the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, a development bank ready to go, fund industry and infrastructure? Australia builds its way out of the COVID depression, manufacturing, industry, agriculture. North Queensland shovel-ready and COVID-free, Hells Gates, Galilee Rail Line, copper string electrification. Not absorb money, but make money projects. And to show you and I are trendy, back in black, highway to hell. Treasurer, cough up the money, make money, make money.
Just before I call the Treasurer, the only part of it that was a question was the can at the start. So the Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Kennedy for his question. And well, firstly, I'd like to say that the government, through its $100 billion 10-year infrastructure pipeline, is making a record investment in infrastructure. When it comes to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and the Minister for Energy, who has responsibility for it, may want to add to this answer, it's already made commitments of some $8 billion with projects with a value of over $28 billion as of the end of March 2020. In respect to the copper string project, in 2019 the government announced $4.7 million to assist with the costs of feasibility work for that project, which is a proposed transmission line between Mount Isa and Hughden. In terms of the copper string project, as you know, it will allow major users in the Mount Isa region to access reliable and affordable energy from the national electricity market. In respect to Hells Gate Dam, the government has paid the first tranche of funding for the project, with initial planning and design work focusing at the Big Rocks Weir area near Charter Towers. I'd ask if the Minister for Energy would like to add to that answer.
The Minister for Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I strongly praise the member for Kennedy, not just for his support for Akadaka, but his support for a strong mining and processing industry and energy sector in North Queensland. Of course, that's important not just to North Queensland but to all of Australia. Now, as the Treasurer said, last year we committed $4.7 million to a feasibility study on copper string. It's an important project because it offers the potential to link Mount Isa into the national electricity market to provide more affordable, reliable energy electricity for Mount Isa and the important industry that takes place in Mount Isa, but it also offers opportunity to provide competitive energy for projects along that corridor all the way from Mount Isa through to Hughenden and Townsville, of course. Now, Mr. Speaker, that $4.7 million is there for preparatory work, environmental impact assessment and so on in the feasibility stages. Now, can I also draw the member's attention to our commitment recently to a new $1 billion grid reliability fund. This is to be administered by the CFC, you mentioned in your question, and of course that $1 billion grid reliability fund is very focused on transmission projects that are making energy more affordable, more secure, more reliable for places like Mount Isa. Can I strongly encourage you and the proponents of the projects to continue your discussions with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation?
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's comprehensive range of economic measures are protecting lives and livelihoods as we build a bridge to recovery?
The Treasurer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Boothby for her question and acknowledge her deep background and experience, in particular working for the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and as a journalist prior to entering this place. Mr Speaker, and she, like other members of this House and across the nation, know the significance of the economic shock that has occurred both globally and domestically as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. We've seen some 33 million jobless claims being made in the United States. We have seen here in Australia the Treasury forecast GDP to fall by some 10%, unemployment to rise to some 10%, and we've seen in the information that I detailed in the House yesterday, new house sales falling dramatically, new motor vehicle sales falling dramatically, as well as falls in consumption and in business investment. But, Mr Speaker, we have made some $320 billion of financial commitments, and central to our financial commitments has been the JobKeeper program, Mr Speaker, a record wage subsidy which will assist maintain the formal connection between employers and employees. Like for Central Audio Visual, a family-owned business in South Australia, in Adelaide, Mr Speaker, that provides TV screens, lecterns, microphones for conferences, for expos, for AGMs and for sporting events. Now, Ashley Malcolm from that business contacted the member for Boothby and said to the member for Boothby, as a result of the limits on outdoor and indoor gatherings, they lost thousands of dollars worth of bookings within hours. With no income, they had to make the heartbreaking decision to stand down all of their staff without pay, Mr Speaker, and their hard-working and loyal staff were left without income. Now, Mr Speaker, as a result, the JobKeeper package, according to Ashley Malcolm, has helped save their business, saying in her words that it's acted like a glue for small business owners and employees. And they've spent the last 6 weeks devising in-house training programs to upskill their technical crew. And they've spoken about the mental health advantages that it's had for their staff to be on the JobKeeper program. They've also benefited from the cash flow boost, as well as the arrangements that we have been discussing with the banks to provide deferrals of loan repayments. And Ashley Malcolm says to the member for Boothby, and it's important for this House to recognise this, that given their industry relies on large gatherings, they'll be one of the last to return to normal, but that they're fortunate that the concerns of small business owners were listened to and acted upon by the Morrison government.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can the Australian people trust the Prime Minister with the COVID recovery when he was complacent in the lead-up to the bushfires, despite the clear warnings from experts, and months after the bushfires, debris is still there, but more importantly, survivors are still living in caravans and showering in community halls?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. This government, Mr Speaker, this government put in place the National Bushfire Recovery Fund in January of this year, Mr Speaker. $2 billion was set aside to support the work of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, Mr Speaker. That fund was intended to acquit some $500 million by the 30th of June of this year. We estimate that that figure will exceed over $1 billion by the 30th of June this year. Small business support grants of some $10,000 have now been provided to over 170,000 small businesses affected right across the bushfire-affected areas. In total, small business support has been over $200 million to support those small businesses so devastated. Mr Speaker, there has also been some 1.5 million approvals for small businesses on the greater up to $50 million, $50,000 I should say, Mr Speaker, for small businesses who are seeking their support. Primary producer grants, Mr Speaker, have been provided to the tune of some $127 million to primary producers who are affected by these arrangements. The work is being done to clean debris and that estimated cost is to be over $500 million, Mr Speaker. Over $500 million, and as was reported earlier in this week, South Australia will have largely completed that task very, very shortly. New South Wales, who are managing that work, will have completed that task by the end of June, as I indicated to this House earlier this year. And in Victoria, Mr Speaker, we understand that that task will be completed by August of this year. Now, as the Leader of the Opposition knows, the matters of accommodation for those who are affected are matters that are handled by the states and territories, and we have not received, to the best of my knowledge and on my advice, that any request outstanding from the Commonwealth to provide support for accommodation in these communities. And I look to the Minister for Emergency Management, and he indicates that that is the case. Mr Speaker, we will deal with crises every time they impact on this country, and we'll do it methodically and steadily, and Australians are seeing that in action. If the Leader of the Opposition wants to politicise these things, that is a matter for him.
And I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting the mental health of Australians during the pandemic?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Reid, not just for her interest in this particular question, but for her lifetime of professional service for supporting mental health, in particular as a child psychologist. One of the things which she and so many people in this place would know is the stress, the challenge for mental health which the pandemic has brought. It could be stress brought on by health conditions or the fear that those health conditions may bring to someone's family. It could be the stress of somebody feeling isolation and loneliness, which can be such a profound impact. Or it could be the economic stress of losing one's job or having it threatened, or the challenge of running and owning a small business when cash flow dries up. That's why the support mechanisms such as JobKeeper and JobSeeker have been so important. But I do want to acknowledge in particular the stress which COSBOA related to me only today that small business owners have felt throughout the course of this pandemic. Having said that, there are critical steps that we are taking to support Australians, and I do thank the opposition for their support and all of the members on this side of the chamber for their deep engagement on these questions. We came into the pandemic having invested over $730 million in youth mental health a year ago this week, thanks to the Treasurer and the Prime Minister together. $76 million for bushfire recovery for mental health, and $64 million through Beyond Blue for suicide prevention, with a particular focus on those who have self-harmed previously or those who have suffered the loss of a loved one. Against that background, I mentioned before the $74 million which we've invested. As part of that, we specifically focused on the young and the old. Almost $7 million through Headspace for services to the young, and $10 million for older Australians to focus on their needs as they suffered from potential fears, isolation, loneliness. All of these things have helped build our response. More broadly, I mentioned telehealth earlier, but as we go forwards from this moment, we have the Mental Health Pandemic Plan, which the Prime Minister is taking forward to the National Cabinet. We also have a commitment to work on those telehealth reforms and to provide these services going forwards. And today we have announced, for the first time in Australia, a Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Mental Health, Dr Ruth Byrne, a former Chief Psychiatrist of Victoria and somebody who will carry forward the passions, the commitment and the concerns of Australians everywhere for better, stronger mental health care.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer explain why a university student working a $100 shift per week receives the full $1,500 JobKeeper wage subsidy, but their full-time university tutor with 3 kids to support is not eligible?
The Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, we set out very clearly that with respect to universities that they would be subject to the threshold tests of 30% and 50% depending on their turnover. But we also made the decision as a government to provide the Commonwealth grants to the universities to ensure that they are receiving money equivalent to what their enrolments would have been pre-COVID. Now, Mr Speaker, that's some $18 billion we will see government support for the university sector over this year. That's very substantial indeed.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister provide an update on the government's support for aged care providers and residents in response to the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Lindsay. Of all the members in this place during the course of the pandemic, in many ways the member for Lindsay has had one of the most difficult and heart-wrenching jobs. She has been a constant aid and support and contact and advocate for the families of Newmarch House. We know that since the house was infected with coronavirus, and unfortunately it had spread far through that house before the first diagnosis, that 18 lives have been lost, 16 of which have so far been attributed directly to coronavirus. And I want to commend the member for Lindsay on her work and advocacy and passion and acting as a bridge for residents with both state and Commonwealth governments. More broadly, we know the challenge across Australia, and we have seen, whether it's in the UK or the United States, in France or Spain or Italy, in Canada, the immense tragedy and loss in what they call care homes. And one of the things that has happened in Australia is, even with the tragedy of Newmarch and Dorothy Henderson Lodge, we have had an extraordinary outcome where our aged care workers, our carers, all those involved have helped protect our most frail, our most vulnerable Australians. Over 2,700 residential care homes, and less than 1% of those has had a coronavirus infection. That is almost inconceivable. That is so far ahead of our best-case scenario 2 months ago that it is an unimaginable achievement. And I want to thank everybody in the aged care sector for their incredible dedication. Now, we've supported, with the work of bringing together a code led by the Minister for Aged Care, Senator Colbeck. We have supported with the protections about people coming into homes and difficult restrictions which have saved lives. And we supported with boosting the ventilator capacity to 7,500 units in Australia. But we then backed that with funding, $850 million, which has included over $240 million for our aged care workers to have retention bonuses, to recognise their work as they have stayed on during the course of this pandemic. They've stayed on and provided service and support. We've provided emergency assistance and we've provided support for the providers themselves. All of these things have come together. And so there has been tragedy and loss, and we must mourn each one of those lives, but we must recognise the extraordinary protection that Australians have given to their frail elderly loved ones.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer explain why an 18-year-old living at home who's been working a shift a week at a McDonald's franchise receives the full $1,500 JobKeeper wage subsidy, but a full-time Australian worker at Donata providing catering services to Qantas with a mortgage to repay is not eligible?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Firstly, let me say we very much understand the difficult circumstances that businesses and workers right across the country are facing with this coronavirus pandemic. As the honourable member said himself in this House yesterday, this is a a health crisis that has created an economic crisis. Now, Mr Speaker, we responded with a $130 billion JobKeeper program. We set out very clearly what were the criteria for eligibility under that program, including for full-time workers, for part-time workers, for long-term casuals based on an established definition in the Fair Work Act, as well as we doubled the job seeker payment, effectively the old New Start, Mr Speaker, which is at $1,100 a fortnight. So, Mr Speaker, we have taken unprecedented economic steps. Some people will be eligible for the Job Seeker program, others will be eligible for the JobKeeper program. More than 1 million Australians are on the Job Seeker program, and when it comes to the JobKeeper program, over 800,000 businesses have formally enrolled, representing 5.5 million Australian workers.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister please update the House on the extraordinary efforts of Australian manufacturers in producing critical equipment to support Australians through the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the very fine member for Wentworth for that question. Mr Speaker, very early on, our government was hoping for the best, but diligently preparing for the worst. And so far, the work that we've done, that we have all done, has ensured that our nation was spared the rapid increase in cases that we have seen globally. Now, of course, it's a long road and we're not there yet, but the work that has been done by so many people has meant that we are in a position that many of us could not have imagined we would have been in several months ago. But we cannot and we will not be complacent. Now, Mr Speaker, a number of months ago, many Australians would not have known what PPE stood for. But personal protective equipment has actually been on the front line now of our defence, and it's been in the headlines right across the world. Now, when the Health Minister came to me very early on and asked what we could do to ensure that we had the essential medical supplies that we needed and that our frontline health workers in particular were protected, my mind immediately went to Australian manufacturing and to our Australian manufacturers. Now, it's fair to say that there was a lot of scepticism at the start about whether or not Australian manufacturers would be able to meet the demands that were being put on it. But I have always had confidence in Australian manufacturing and Australian manufacturers, and I was very confident that they would be able to step up, and that's exactly what they have done. Now, many of us are aware of the outstanding successes that we have achieved with the manufacture of medical masks, surgical masks, where we have increased capacity from a couple of million to over 200 million. But there's also an amazing story to be told with ventilators. We did have a manufacturer here in Australia, ResMed, and my department and I have worked around the clock with them and many other manufacturers to meet the needs that we identified. Now, ResMed have delivered 5,500 ventilators ahead of schedule, which is just fantastic. Victoria's Grey Innovation is also leading a consortium of about 30 Australian manufacturers, and they are producing 2,000 ventilators. So for those out there who didn't think that we could do this, I'm very happy to say that you were wrong, because not only didn't we believe that we could do this, it's actually happened right across Australia. So hats off and a big thank you to Australian manufacturers. So well done to them. So this is congratulations to our Australian manufacturers, and I think everyone in this entire chamber should be very proud of the great work that they've done. It's a credit to our Australian manufacturers. Thank you and well done.
Member for Bruce. I call the member for Blaxland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing. Will the government develop a housing construction industry stimulus plan to keep Australia's almost 1 million bricklayers, carpenters, electricians and lots of other workers in the housing construction industry in a job?
The Minister for Housing has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question. Obviously, those businesses that are engaged in the housing industry, the minister's right, it's a big industry, over 1 million employees, importantly have been supported by the JobKeeper package, $130 billion. The Treasurer has outlined today just how important that has been for so many businesses. In addition, one of the first things we did was announce $1.3 billion to support apprentices, 50% of the wage for apprentices, which is a huge beneficiary of that program. Obviously, are businesses in the residential and other construction industries. In addition to all of that, we put in place at the beginning of this year the first home loan deposit scheme, which has increased demand for new homes particularly, which means if there are customers for those homes, there are building sites for all of the people that the minister spoke about to work on. So far, under the first home loan deposit scheme, we've had about 8,800 new homes, or people who are now beneficiaries of a guarantee, who are able to go out and search for their first property with a deposit of as little as 5%. In addition to all of that, we set up the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which has channelled $1.3 billion into social and affordable housing projects. $1.3 billion has already flowed into social and affordable housing projects, which of course stimulates the industry. But what I would say to the Shadow Minister is what the industry does not need, what it absolutely does not need, are Labor's housing taxes, which are still your policy. They are still Labor policy. Now, all of the groups that I suspect the Shadow Minister's talking to campaigned ferociously against that because of how devastating it would be for their businesses, how devastating it would be for the millions of workers that the Shadow Minister spoke about. So what the residential construction industry doesn't read right now—
If the Minister can pause for a second and the member for Lawler can stop interjecting. The difficulty with where the minister's entitled to compare and contrast to a very limited degree, which he's done, but the question did not ask for alternative policies in any way. So he needs to bring himself back to the question, which was whether the government will deliver a stimulus plan.
No, thank you, Mr Speaker. The truth does hurt, but in the end, we have made huge investments into the industry. We have already, as I say, brought forward demand by the first home loan deposit scheme, a scheme that the Labor Party also opposed, albeit for about an hour. The National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which has delivered over 1,500 new dwellings just this year, supporting our community housing providers. So we have got ahead of the curve. We have made these investments. We are supporting the businesses in the industry and the million people that work in it, and we will continue to provide that support.
The member for Bowman.
Thank you, Speaker. A question to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney outline to the House how the Morrison government is working to assist businesses and their employees to have the confidence to return to work in a COVID-safe Australia?
The Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bowman for his question and his interest in this area. And as has been noted today with the Treasurer, there are now 835,000 businesses which employ more than 5.5 million workers formally enrolled in the JobKeeper program. And of course, the JobKeeper program included key changes inserted temporarily into the Fair Work Act to allow greater flexibility in directions on hours, the duties of employees and the location of work. Now, I think it's testament to the cooperation and common sense that's occurring in workplaces right across Australia, and also I think to the simplicity of the design principle, some of which have been raised today, the flat rate of the fee, using existing delivery and assessment mechanisms through the ATO, the centralisation of the changes to the Fair Work Act. But when you consider the scale and spread and number of the people who now fall inside those changes to the Fair Work Act and to the JobKeeper program, there have been only 265 complaints made to the Fair Work Commission regarding those changes. when you consider how small that number is to the scale of the changes and the number of people that are brought within this system, that is actually quite a remarkable early achievement. The next thing that we have to work on is, as we reanimate parts of the economy, is getting everyone back to work safely. Now, that's whether or not you're part of the JobKeeper program, whether or not you've been part of the changes in hospitality, restaurants or Clark's Awards that the government has supported the process for. What I'd like to do is draw the House and the attention of the Australian public to the Safe Work Australia website, safeworkaustralia.gov.au. There are conventional obligations under occupational health and safety laws for businesses to put appropriate measures in place to ensure a safe working environment. Now, in the COVID-19 recovery phase, those conventional requirements to ensure a safe working environment are going to be in the context of the very unconventional facts of life that we now experience: social distancing, advanced hygiene, appropriate advanced cleaning practices and a range of other responses. So what has been a response? The National Cabinet has adopted the National COVID-19 Safe Workplace Principles. The workplace health and safety part of the Safe Work Australia website has been totally rebuilt. So what it now consists of is a central hub of guidance, tools, information kits across 23 industry sectors, starting with aged care, ending with warehousing and logistics, 22 workplace health and safety topics related to COVID-19. There are now 1,300 individual web pages which can provide specific detailed information for businesses planning their way out of this crisis. And I might note that the thirst for this sort of information is clear. It's being responded to. There have been 1.7 million page views of that rebuilt website this month. So we implore working Australians to get out, look at the web page, and we'll get back to work.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Figures released today show annual wages growth slowed to a 2-year low in the first quarter of this year, before the worst of the coronavirus outbreak. Is this the kind of economy the government wants to snap back to?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said in the House yesterday, the impact on household consumption, on household savings, there will be an impact on wages. There will be a significant impact across the economy. But I do want to point out to the member for Rankin that under this government, the minimum wage has gone up every year, Mr. Speaker. Every year, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is,
Members on my left.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Rankin is getting angry. Angry because he's irrelevant. Angry because he's irrelevant to the debate. He's been talking down the economy before the crisis. He's now talking down the economy through the crisis, and he'll be talking down the economy after the crisis. The Australian people understand and trust the coalition to manage the economy better than Labor ever will.
Hang on. I'm trying to call the next question. The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Acting Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is keeping Australians safe and united in Australia's response to the coronavirus? And will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting the Chinese-Australian community, including in my electorate of Chisholm?
The Minister for Immigration.
Well, I thank the member for Chisholm for her question and also for her outstanding leadership in her electorate and indeed throughout the Australian Chinese community, particularly in the last couple of months. Mr. Speaker, in times of adversity, Australians often shine, and I think we've absolutely seen that this year. First in our response to the fires, and secondly in relation to Australia's response in relation to the pandemic. And this absolutely includes the responses we've seen from our multicultural communities. I've got to say, Mr. Speaker, that I was absolutely blown away by the generosity of multicultural communities after the bushfires in terms of how much money they raised and the food distribution and the like. But equally, they have been incredible in terms of their response to this pandemic. And I'd particularly like to make mention of the Australian Chinese community in this regard because in some respects they were on the front line of the pandemic very early on because they were the ones that first went into self-isolation. They were the ones who were returning from family visits into China and then returning home. And as the Prime Minister himself has said in relation to that, it was through their care, it was through their commitments, their patience, that Australia was protected in that first wave, and I think that's absolutely right. Mr Speaker, the government has gone to extraordinary efforts to indicate our support to our multicultural communities, to communicate with them. We've translated all of the key fact sheets into 63 different languages and disseminated them broadly. We've had over 2,000 engagements with individual multicultural leaders in the last 2 months alone. I've regularly communicated through the multicultural media, both individually and collectively. And in each one of those engagements, our message has been the same. Our message has been that we are there to support them, to communicate with them what support is available individually and what support is available for their businesses, to communicate to them about what the social distancing requirements are, to thank them for their extraordinary efforts in getting control of this pandemic, and sadly, though, in recent times, to also point out and reassure them that racism has no place in this country and that we're on their side if there is any instances of racism, and they should rightly report it and call it out, as we have been doing. Mr Speaker, we live in the greatest multicultural country in the world, bar none. And when the chips are down in this country, all Australians chip in. And we've absolutely seen that this year from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, all religions, all ethnicities, and I just so thank the multicultural communities for their effort. They've been such a big part of getting to this stage of the pandemic, and they'll be an equally important part in the recovery.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister tell the House on the 27th of February that in relation to sports rights, and I quote, "Authority for these decisions was the Minister for Sport," when in fact the Audit Office has told the Parliament that the Prime Minister's office told the Minister for Sport's office, and I quote, "It was expected that the Minister would write to the Prime Minister to seek authority on the approved projects."
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer the member to my many statements on this in the House, Mr Speaker. The authority for making the decisions in relation to that program was the Minister for Sport. That is the fact, Mr Speaker. It may be inconvenient to the opposition that that is the fact, but that is the fact, Mr Speaker. The only authority sought from the Prime Minister's office and from myself, Mr Speaker, was in relation to announcements.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services. Will the Minister update the House on what the Morrison government has done to ensure Australians get the support they need during the corona crisis, particularly through Services Australia?
The Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and for Government Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Groom for all his hard work over the last few months as we have dealt with an unprecedented demand and significant new challenges that everyone in this House is having to step up to. Staff from Services Australia likewise have stepped into this challenge and have been working around the clock to deliver new and improved income support measures and fast-tracking our coronavirus financial support. This extraordinary effort by Services Australia has seen an additional 12,000 staff from either outside or within, as in redeployed within the Australian Public Service, that have been recruited and trained in call centres and claims processing, indeed even in this building, as the Speaker said yesterday. We've worked to ensure stability of core systems. MyGov now increased concurrent capacity from 6,000 to 300,000 users, work that was done in a matter of days. We've made it much simpler for Australians to get financial support and, crucially, reduced the need for Australian citizens to pop into a Services Australia shopfront. Before the coronavirus pandemic, 570,000 Australians used to access MyGov every day. Today, it's 1.7 million. Indeed, from the 16th of March to the 21st of April, 50 million logins to MyGov by Australian citizens. Yeah. The biggest day to date has seen 3 million logins to MyGov. The preceding biggest day was tax time last year at 1.8 million. We've also done massive strides in process simplification and updating digital processes. From the 25th of March, you could lodge your intent to claim online. Over the last 3 weeks, we've allowed people to establish their digital identity and get a customer reference number, normally having to go into a shop centre. That can now be done online. Indeed, as at last night, 204,000 Australians had created a customer reference number online. We've streamlined the job seeker payment to just 20 questions, halving the time it takes someone to complete that. And a bit over 50 days from the 16th of March, Services Australia processed 1.1 million claims. Just over 50 days, which is the same number of claims the agency normally does in a 2-year period. The agency's paid $5.2 billion in the first round of $750 economic support payments to 7 million Australians, and the $550 supplement is now being paid to more than 1.9 million recipients. On top of this, all of the business-as-usual work has continued, and yesterday BAU claims were less than the same period the preceding year. All of this is due to extraordinary hard work of public servants in Services Australia, and can I say a very large thank you to all of them for the hard work that they've done.
The member for Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How many workers are missing out on childcare places because the government is spending $500 million less on childcare than they budgeted for?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the Shadow Minister for a question, because it's an incredibly important question. And before I go to the heart of it, can I once again just express for all those early educators who have made sure that the childcare sector has been able to offer services right through this pandemic, my thanks, and the thanks of all of us here in the House, but because it's been incredibly important. I'll now just step through, for the Shadow Minister, what we've done to fund childcare through the last couple of months through this pandemic. We are providing $1.6 billion for free childcare this quarter, $1.6 billion, supporting around 1 million families. And importantly, because it was calibrated to work with JobKeeper as well, we're also providing $1 billion to the sector through JobKeeper. Now, that means we've got $2.6 billion supporting 13,000 services and their staff to stay open and be employed. And that has been incredibly important, because if you look what has happened around the world, there hasn't been that type of assistance provided. And so we stand compared to every other comparison internationally as a gold star in protecting our childcare sector through this pandemic. And I'll just let the Shadow Minister know what Paul Mondo, the Australian Childcare Alliance President, said in April 2020. The significance of this cannot be underestimated. The day before this emergency package was announced by the Prime Minister and Minister Tehan, a survey showed that up to 30% of our members would be forced to close their centres within days. 30% would have been forced to close within days. Now, as of today, we have 98% of services open, and we are seeing attendances continue to rise. Between 40 to 60% on average is the attendance that we're getting. So rather than the sector collapsing, we have a sector that now is ready and prepared to grow with the economy as we come out of this pandemic. And I say to the Shadow Minister, this is something that she should support. Indeed. What the sector has been able to do in manage itself through this pandemic is something that all Australians should be proud of. And I stand ready to work with the sector over the coming weeks and months to make sure that it can continue to grow as we emerge from this pandemic.
The member for Hughes.
My question is to the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's JobKeeper payment is helping Australian businesses stay in business?
The Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Hughes for his question. No doubt the member for Hughes is a champion of many causes, but the small businesses in his electorate, indeed all businesses in his electorate and everyone that's working hard each and every day who he backs. And it's wonderful to report that, yes, the JobKeeper has been something that has been spoken about in this House many, many times, but rightly so. And as the Treasurer has outlined on a number of occasions, the enthusiastic take-up of this program has been something that is perhaps unsurprising, but the way in which it is being administered, the way in which it is being rolled out has provided an extraordinary lifeline now for 850,000 Australian businesses. 850,000 businesses that covers some 5.7 million employees, and both of those numbers are growing. Mr Speaker, it's been an extraordinary effort to get to this point, and for those 850,000 businesses covering 5.7 million employees, the average time that they are waiting to receive their JobKeeper payments are about 2 to 3 days. That, again, to add to perhaps what the Minister for Government Services has said, has been and relied upon a huge effort from our public service, and in this case I want to say a huge effort from the employees and the leadership of the Australian Taxation Office. Indeed, in my daily reports from the ATO, it's extraordinary just to see the amount of volume of traffic that they have been assisting Australian taxpayers with. For example, the average call volumes in the last couple of weeks has been 87,000 phone calls a day that they've been attending to. They have been extended their hours till very late at night and all weekend. And to put that into some context, at this time last year they were attending to 35,000 calls a day, so more than double. And that has relied upon the extraordinary commitment of our members of the ATO who have delivered for those Australian businesses. Now, just before question time, I was speaking to the Mayor of Melbourne, and we were talking about a range of topics, and one of the things that she said to me about the impact it's had on businesses that she has spoken to is not just obviously the direct support and the confidence, but for those businesses that have tried to pivot, those, say, food businesses that have moved to takeaway, it has supported that pivot of their business model because obviously their employees have a largely subsidised wage. So the JobKeeper support that we are providing has been exceptionally important, will continue to be exceptionally important, and I again want to thank our public servants who have delivered this in such a quick fashion for Australian businesses.
The member for Kingsford Smith.
Speaker, my question's to the Prime Minister. Natalie operates a childcare centre in Maroubra in my electorate, which employs 8 people. Her revenue has halved since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, and only 5 of her employees are eligible for JobKeeper. She's had to turn away 8 children so far. How are Australian mums and dads meant to go back to work if they can't get access for childcare for their children?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question. And it is a very important question because we do want to make sure that the sector can continue to grow as we come out of the pandemic. Now, what we put in place was a significant package to enable the sector to get through the pandemic, and it included free childcare. It had 3 priority areas that we wanted to achieve through this, including making sure parents stayed engaged with their childcare centre so that when we came out of this pandemic, they would be able to go back to that centre as they went back into employment. Now, when we announced this, we said that we would have a 4-week review process, and that 4-week review process has taken place. And we are now looking at that review, and we will have further refinements to play. As you know, when you make a significant change like we did, we paused the existing system and in the space of days put in place a new system. And we knew at that time that there would be certain unintended consequences that we would have to work through, and that's why we put a 4-week review process in place. But I stand here today thanking the childcare sector for the way that they cooperated with the government in putting the new system in place. And can I also thank all those departmental officials who worked tirelessly to also help us put this new scheme in place. It was those efforts which mean we stand here today and can say quite proudly that 98% of the childcare sector is open and is operating and is looking after those children to make sure that they get the care and education that they deserve, despite what we've been through with the coronavirus pandemic. This is something that all of us in this House should be incredibly proud of, and in particular those early childhood educators who have provided those services stayed open in particular to make sure that those essential service workers could get the care that they needed for their children, and for those vulnerable children that they could continue to get the care that they needed. Because if we had have seen mass closures of the sector, and that is what was going to happen, and we've seen that, Paul Mundo, as I quoted before, said that that was going to happen, those vulnerable children would not have got that care. Those essential service workers would not have got that care. And as a nation, we would not have dealt with this pandemic as well as we should have. So this package was incredibly important for this nation, and I look forward to continue working with the sector as we come out of the pandemic to make sure that the childcare sector continues to thrive.
Well done. The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Cyber Safety and the Arts. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's work to fix the NBN has enabled Australians to work and learn from home during the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Communications.
Well, I do thank the member for Ford, who's got a long-standing interest in the national broadband network and in seeing Australians get the broadband services that they need. Now, as we know, COVID-19 essentially came out of nowhere, and suddenly millions of Australians were needing just about overnight to work and study from home. And just when our nation needed it, Mr Speaker, the NBN was there to deliver Australians the reliable and affordable broadband that they needed. When you've got typically mum, dad and a couple of kids at home working and studying, perhaps 4 separate laptops all going at once, you need a reliable broadband connection. When you're video conferencing, so you need to have high upload speeds as well as download speeds, that's where you need a good broadband connection. When there's increased demand for streaming video and for games, that's when you need a good broadband connection. And, Mr Speaker, the historical record shows that when we came to government in 2013, we made a decision to drive the rollout of the NBN as fast and as hard as we could. And thanks to that decision, today there are 11.3 million premises able to connect. 7 million premises are connected. We're seeing premises connected increasing by between 30 and 40,000 a week, and over 80% of new customers, Mr Speaker, are taking a 50 megabit per second or higher plan. If we had not made the decision we made in 2013, there would have been at this time around 3.5 million fewer premises able to connect to the NBN. That decision we made in 2013 has been key to Australians working and studying from home, able to do that with the benefit of having a national broadband network connection. And the NBN has also held up well when it comes to the sharp jump in traffic, with peak traffic up 53% last Friday compared to the same day last week in February. I want to acknowledge everybody at the NBN, everybody across the entire telecommunications sector who's worked so hard. The NBN's provided 40% additional capacity to its service providers at no extra cost. We've seen the SVOD providers, Netflix and others, agree to reduce their bit rate to deliver more capacity. We've got NBN providing extra capacity at no charge, upgrades to GP clinics to support telehealth. The NBN has been a critical part of Australia's response to COVID-19, and I thank them for what they've done.
The Prime Minister.
Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and if I may, I just want to clarify an answer that I gave earlier today in response to the Leader of the Opposition. Just in relation to the statistics, there have been $170 million in $10,000 small business support grants made to 17,000 small businesses in relation to the Black Summer bushfires. There have also been $40 million in small business recovery grants of up to 50,000 made to 1,400 small businesses, and there have been over $108 million in primary producer recovery grants of up to 75,000 made to over 1,700 primary producers.